I don't know if you have ever looked at a topographical map before, or if you have referenced a topographical map, but topographical maps can be super helpful, right? If you just kind of use Google Maps or your Apple Maps to get from one place to another, it'll tell you like how long it takes probably and how many kilometers and roughly, given the speed limit, how long it should take you to get to where you're going and what roads you should take, or whether you have to take a ferry or whether there's construction or all that kind of stuff. It'll tell you all that information, but a topographical map will tell you some different information. It'll tell you about elevations and slopes and different features of landscapes. And so, for example, if you're kind of looking at a topographical map of a mountain range, you'll kind of know, well, there's peaks here and valleys here, and there's, the elevation is this. Or if you're looking at one when you're out in the boat, you'll know you want to avoid that spot where there's a rock ledge at low tide, because you'll probably lose your propeller, whatever it might be. You're kind of watching for those features, and in fact, now on some digital maps, you can actually see the topographical map of a city, and you can see how high certain buildings are. Other interesting features of the landscape that kind of gives you a picture of more than a two-dimensional, just kind of view of things. And so, whether it's again mountains, rock formations, valleys, buildings, whatever, it can be super helpful depending on what you're doing. Now, the thing about topographical maps is they're helpful for that, but we often use, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but we've often used topographical language to describe life experiences sometimes. You ever noticed that before? So we say things like, that was really a mountaintop experience. Right? It was just kind of walking on the clouds. It was amazing. It was thrilling. It was fantastic. Sometimes we talk about, hey, I'm in a valley right now, right? I've just been brought low. It seems like the mountains are no longer kind of this place of, oh man, the view is awesome and things are exciting. It's kind of like the opposite of that. I'm down here in the valley and it's dark and it's scary. We talk about things like the wilderness as being a place where there's scarcity and there's not much going on. We use that kind of language sometimes to describe our present life circumstances of the highs and the lows and of everywhere in between. And the reality is that for all of us, here's what is absolutely true, and maybe you've experienced this before, is that no matter where we might describe ourselves using that kind of language, we're all either one text or one phone call away from the scenery changing in an instant, aren't we? I mean, you could be just, things are amazing, and all of a sudden, you get the phone call, and it's all changed, right? The hard situation, the accident, the difficult news, the whatever it might be, and it's not good. Or you could be in a space where you're thinking, it's hopeless, I don't know if there's a way forward, it's really tough, and all of a sudden the call comes, and things are all of a sudden looking up, right? We're all one text, one phone call, one conversation away from the scenery possibly changing. And today, what we're going to discover as we take a look at this part of Elijah's life that's described for us in 1 Kings 19 is we're going to see that last week we talked about how Elijah was literally on the top of a mountain and has this mountaintop experience of God, that something incredible happens, that God's power was on display in a way that was unmistakable and was remarkable and was fantastic. And yet it wasn't long after that the scenery changed and he literally finds himself no longer on the mountain, but into the wild. Right? And not just literally, but also figuratively in terms of emotionally, spiritually, and all other ways. He finds himself in that place of wilderness, of wandering, of hiding, of temptation, of scarcity, of danger. Maybe you find yourself there too. If you recall last week, we talked about how in chapter 18, how the Lord had said to Elijah that there wasn't going to be rain on the earth for 3 years. And Elijah went and told King Ahab, this is going to happen. There's not going to be rain on the earth for quite some time until I say so, until the word of the Lord comes, that he's going to cause rain to fall on the earth. And that caused severe famine, caused severe drought, and caused all kinds of issues, right? We said that not only only were there livelihood issues, there were livestock issues, there were issues that pertain to the economy, there were issues that pertain to just kind of everyday life and living, right, of being able to have enough water to drink or to cook with, those kinds of things. But there was also, in the context of all that, there was religious turmoil, there was political turmoil, there was all this kind of stuff that had come as a result of Ahab's marriage to his wife Jezebel, who was the daughter of a king of a foreign land. And so through that marriage, what happens is that Jezebel begins to introduce now, and Ahab with her, in the northern tribes of Israel, begins to introduce the worship of Baal or Baal. And so following all of this, Jezebel begins to implement policy. She begins to actually have the prophets of the Lord, of Yahweh, killed in order to have her kind of religious preferences pushed forward. All these kinds of things are happening in Israel. And Ahab, the king, who's called the most wicked king in all of Israel's history, does nothing to prevent it from happening. And so in the midst of all this, because there's been a drought, Elijah has kind of been in hiding. He's not been around. He's waiting for the word of the Lord to come and say, hey, you need to go back to Ahab and tell him it's going to rain. And so 3 years pass. And during those 3 years, because Ahab is getting a little bit anxious, he's getting a little bit nervous, he's seeing how this is affecting everything. And he's sent people all over to different nations, to different places, to look through caves and towns and everywhere else to find Elijah, because he knows that at Elijah's word that it will rain again. And that's what Ahab so desperately desires. Well, finally, the word of God comes to Elijah and says, go to Ahab and tell him it's going to rain. And so we find that while Ahab and Obadiah had split up to look for some water in the land, Obadiah runs into Ahab. And in the process, Elijah tells him, I'm going to meet with Ahab on top of Mount Carmel. Tell him to come there with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and we'll all meet there together. And they do. And in the midst of that, Elijah proposes, hey, let's find out who really is God. Let's find out who really is God in Israel. And we set up this little contest between Baal and God. And what happens at the end is that Yahweh answers with fire when Baal did not. And what we see, there's this curious and fascinating verse in the midst of Elijah's prayer where he says, Lord, I'm praying this today so that the people here will know that you are starting to turn hearts back to you again. And the fire fell, and people that were there repented, and it seemed like this great revival was starting to take place. Right? And what we said last week is that perhaps out of difficult and painful circumstances, that is the birthplace for revival. And so instead of seeing that as something that we should always be pushing against, and we might be able to see it now as this is God's way of creating the space and the opportunity for revival to be born. And so in the midst of that, though, what happens is after the contest, we left off with something very difficult that happens. As God has sent fire from heaven and people start to turn back to him, there's one thing that takes place, that the story takes a drastic turn. And we read the verse last week and we said, well, unpack it just a little bit today, because that verse of what happens next is something that we have a hard time with. I don't know, maybe you don't, but I know for me, when I read it, I'm like, this is a little bit hard to swallow. It's hard to deal with. It's hard to even imagine how this took place, let alone that it did take place. And so here's what we read in verse 40 of chapter 18. After all of this happens, the people fall on their faces. The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And there's this revival that starts on the top of the mountain. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal and don't let any of them escape. And they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Now, I don't know if that's hard to read for you, but I know it is. Elijah, in the midst of this revival, says, don't let any of the prophets of Baal escape. Now, again, there's a long history attached to this, okay? So let's not forget that. And he takes them down to the brook, and all these people caught up in the revival, Elijah just has all the prophets of Baal slaughtered there at the brook. Those who had repented and turned back to the Lord come down, and all the prophets of Baal, the prophets of Baal are all killed right there. Now, we don't understand that Elijah himself did this all in one sweep in one moment. There's probably many people participating in what takes place at his word. And the thing is that this is really offensive, right? Because it seems like a drastic action toward the thing that happened, right? Like, what gives Elijah the right to have this ordered? And isn't this the kind of thing that we find offensive? That we might even say that in this day and age, we've moved on culturally from this kind of thing, right? And we look back and say, that is absolutely fanatical. Right? It's cruel. It really is. We might say it's vindictive. Like, where's the process of justice along here? This sounds like something that the alt-right or the alt-left might actually do. That needs to be condemned, and people need to be brought to justice, and all of that. I mean, this is a terrible and terrifying thing to read about in the scriptures. And I can understand our sensitivity to that, but as I was kind of processing through this, as I was writing, I came across this commentary that quite simply said this, and I don't know that the answer is this simple, but I just want to put it out there for us because we don't have time to unpack all this, because that's the theme of the morning is not, how do we deal with these difficult texts in the Old Testament, although we'll just scratch on it here for a moment, but maybe another time we can kind of pull our way through that more in depth and all the layers of it. But listen, one commentator simply says this, that Elijah's action needs no such lame apologies. Which again sounds like, well, that's an easy write-off, right? Like, how could that happen? Well, the reality is that at the time, the law of the covenant that the people of Israel had agreed to, that when they were at Mount Sinai and when God was forming his people and forming a nation, he says, this is the way it's going to work between me and you, my people. Right? There are certain boundaries. There are certain things that I expect you as a holy nation to live by. If you're going to be the light to the world, right, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. And this is the covenant relationship that we are going to share. And all the people said, yes, that is what we want. And in Exodus chapter 20, we have what we call the Big Ten, right? The 10 Commandments of God. Those are the ones we're most familiar with, right? Here's the law, right? You shall have no other gods before me, right? That's one of them, right? You shall not worship, right? Like, so there's no other gods before me. You're not going to worship any other gods. It's me and you. No foreign deities, no kind of weird things happening. That's not what's supposed to happen. And yet now in Israel, this many hundreds of years later, we see this very thing happening in the nation. Now in Exodus chapter 20 and following, what we have is the book of the covenant, which outlines in further detail, more than just the 10 commandments, there's all the other commandments and rules that are attached to how things like social justice should work, within the nation of Israel at that time, laws about restitution and what to do when things go wrong, how we deal with all that. And in chapter 22, verse 20, it simply says that whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. That was the national policy. That's the way that the covenant worked between God and his people. That's what was expected. We've agreed that you will be God, and we will be your people, and we will follow you. And if we don't do that, we will incur the curse that comes from disobedience. And so for Elijah, and in that day, and in that time, and under that covenant, Elijah was completely justified in what took place. Now, we can debate, and we can disagree, and we can be offended, but again, that was the covenant relationship in place at the time, the national policy based on God's covenant with his people. Now, we live under a new covenant. We live in a new space, right? We live under a different arrangement with God. So please don't come away from this morning and say, well, the scriptures say, so we should just all go and do likewise. Okay, that's not what I'm saying this morning. That's why I say it takes a lot more layers, and it's a lot more complicated than that, because again, we live under a new arrangement and a new covenant. We are not the nation of Israel under this covenant. And so the way that those things get dealt with is different, but that's how it was then. And that was the arrangement that God had with his people. And so Elijah takes them down to the brook. Now, What happens next? If you remember, the past 3 years, there's been a drought and there's not been any rain on the land. And so Elijah says to Ahab, he says, go up and eat and drink. Okay, so this is after all this has taken place. He goes back to Ahab and he says, hey, Ahab, I want you to go eat and drink because there's a sound of rushing rain. The promise of rain is now coming. God has said there's going to be rain in the land. And Ahab, you can expect that that's going to happen and you can celebrate. And so Elijah went up on the top of the mountain and he bowed himself down on the earth and he put his face between his knees and he said to his servant, go up now and look toward the sea. And he went up and he looked and he said, there's nothing there. And he said, go again 7 times. And on the 7th time he said this, behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising up from the sea. And he said, go up and say to Ahab, get your chariot ready and go down to Jezreel, lest the rain stop you. And in a little while, the heavens grew black, and the clouds and wind, and there was great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garments. He pulled them up around his knees, so he's got way to run, not in his garment that he has. And he starts to run, and he runs before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And so now God has promised that the rain is coming back. And so it's going to begin to rain, and it actually does begin to rain on the earth after 3 years of drought, which caused famine, which caused uncertainty, which caused most likely death for many people. God sends rain on the earth. Again, now we would think, again, the rain that follows revival, Elijah has got to be way up here. The things that God is doing are amazing. We're seeing this incredible stuff happen. And Elijah has just got to be on the top, again, of the mountain, literally and figuratively. And he's just got to, this is an incredible moment to be a part of what God is doing. Have you ever been there before? There's an incredible thing that God's moving in a powerful way, that something's taken place that is undeniable, that the Spirit and the hand of the Lord is in the midst of it, doing a marvelous thing, and we just get to be part of and witnesses to it. I mean, that is an incredible experience, an incredible place to be in. But in this moment, it's followed by something much less incredible. Here's how the story goes. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Everything that happened on the top of the mountain, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now, how does that news set with Jezebel? Her 450 prophets, of all the religious institution that she's ushered into Israel. Does that sit well with her? This is the participation part of the service. Yes, no. Is this okay? You're still with me this morning? Are we still here? Okay, yes. So this isn't sitting well with Jezebel, and she is not happy. She who had put many prophets of the Lord to death has now had many of her prophets under, the law of God put to death, and she is furious. And she says, Jezebel sends a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Now, this is a threat on Elijah's life, quite literally, and she had the power and the means to carry it out. Right? So Jezebel, in response, threatens his life and curses herself in the process if it doesn't happen. And then we're told that Elijah was afraid, to which you probably would be too. And I would be too. In the midst of, everything's amazing, and all of a sudden the one message comes through and the whole scenery changes. Everything shifts for Elijah. Right? And Elijah, in this moment, what does he do? He gets up and he runs for his life, literally, and he comes to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant. Now, what we notice is that Beersheba, which is in Judah, is outside of the jurisdiction of northern Israel. So he runs out of the jurisdiction of Jezebel and of her reach. And so afraid, following this incredible experience of God, just goes all the way to the valley, into the wilderness, and he runs for his life because now he's a fugitive of the law. And as he goes a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and he sat down under a broom tree and he asked the Lord that he might die. This is the low of lows. He just simply goes from great revival to, God, I'm done. I don't want to any more. He says, it's enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Again, a curious turn of events from what just happened for him. It sounds a lot like Jonah. Do you notice that? He sits down under a broom tree. He just simply says, this isn't right, this isn't fair, God, take my life. Like, it's a very similar circumstance. And yet he says to the Lord, he says, here's my reasoning. My ministry is fruitless. I haven't had any more success than any of the other prophets that have gone before me. Every single one of them has been faithful to you, God. And I too have been faithful to you, Lord. And yet my ministry has been no more successful than anybody else. The fruit just doesn't seem to be there. I feel absolutely defeated. And now somebody wants to take my life. And Lord, I would rather that you just simply do it yourself. That's a tough spot to be in. But what happens next is also really important. What happens to Elijah as he sits under the broom tree is that he's so exhausted and he's so tired from running that he falls asleep. And after he wakes up, what he wakes to is the presence of an angel who has baked some bread over fire. And not only there's this cake of bread there for him, but it's warm bread. Right? Can everybody kind of smell it? Right? You know the feeling of the warm bread, and you're just kind of getting the butter out, and it's melting as you're spreading it across, right? This homemade, just beautiful loaf of bread. And so there's this warm bread there, and there's some water provided for Elijah, and he eats and he drinks, and on the strength of that one meal, he runs for 40 days. And he goes to a place which is called Horeb, which is traditionally known as the mountain of God, the place of God's presence. Horeb, again, is also out of Jezebel's jurisdiction. She's likely not going to chase him there at this place at this time. But listen, Horeb is the place that where God's presence has throughout history been made manifest. And so what we actually see Elijah doing while he's running from Jezebel is going to a place where hopefully he will be able to meet with God, whom he has asked to take his life from him because he feels unsuccessful. There's no fruit in my ministry. There's nothing going forward. In fact, there's all kinds of opposition and issues, and there's threats on my life, and it's hard and it's difficult, God, and I'm just ready to be done. And that's the place that he's in. And when we get to verse 9 of chapter 19, it says this, and there he came to a cave. This is on Mount Horeb, and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, and the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? It's an interesting question, isn't it? What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah simply says, I have been very jealous for the Lord. And this isn't jealous in the negative sense. It's kind of like the jealousy you have for your spouse, that you will fight for them, right? That you love them, that you're concerned for them, that you work for their best interest, that you will protect them, right? That's kind of the idea. I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel, he says, have forsaken your covenant, and they've thrown down your altars, and they've killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only am left. I'm the only one, God, that's left. And they are trying to take my life away. Now, is it true that Elijah is the only one left? Is that true? No, right? Like, what's just happened? There's a whole bunch of people on the top of a mountain that says, the Lord, he's God, the Lord, he's God. We are turning our hearts. Elijah even prayed that our hearts would be turned back, and here we are. God is sending revival. And so there's a whole bunch of people, the people of God, that are experiencing this. And also before that, what did Obadiah tell who am I talking about? Elijah. What did Obadiah tell Elijah as well? He said, don't you know that I've hidden 100 prophets in the caves, Elijah? You're not the only one, Elijah. But what has Elijah done? He's told himself a lie. God, I'm the only one that's left. I'm the only one that's faithful. I am the last holdout, and I am done for. And so it is interesting. This is his emotion talking in the midst of this. And he says that, and people want to take my life. They want me dead. And here's the reality of this. Maybe we haven't experienced to this level. Maybe for some of us we have, and we've had these thoughts and these struggles. Or maybe our discouragement, or maybe our feelings of defeat have been a little more mild than what Elijah is going through. But we've all struggled with discouragement and feelings of defeat, have we not? Did I get a yes to that? Is there anybody who's never been there before? Tell us your secret if you have, okay? Because here's Elijah. For you, whether it's the future is uncertain, your dreams have been crushed or delayed. Maybe you're trying to hold the thing together, the friendship, the business, the thing that you are a part of, that people are involved in. You're trying to pull it all together. Or maybe it's just there's a whole lot of confusion. There's a whole lot of polarization. There's division. There's a whole lot of pain. There's a whole lot of just circumstances that maybe are within or outside of your control, whatever it might be. We can find ourselves running from in an instant, top of the game, things are humming, everything's great, to all of a sudden I feel done for. I feel I'm the only one left, and I'm just forget it all. God, just take me out of the game. I'd be very happy if that's what you did. And the fascinating thing is that for us, when we find ourselves in places of discouragement or defeat, do you know what our first response sometimes is? It's isolation. We tend to isolate ourselves. You ever notice that? We get discouraged and defeated, and we withdraw. We pull away. We hide out, right? We don't go out places. We stop talking to friends. We don't go to the family dinner. We focus on other things that don't have to move us into a space where there's other people. We often isolate ourselves, and what comes with isolation is often self-pity. Right? We do that. We begin to remind ourselves of all the things that are wrong and all the things that have gone bad, and we even begin to tell ourselves things about either ourselves or the situation that may or may not be true. But our tendency is to isolate and towards self-pity. And does that not sound exactly like what Elijah is doing? He's running away, and he's hiding in a cave, and he's convinced himself of something that's not true. And he's told God, I'm done. We get sucked into a spinning vortex that is really hard to get out of. Henry Cloud, who is a Christian psychologist, says this. He says it's really easy for our brains to process events in negative ways, but predictable ways. Our brains often will process things in negative ways, but those negative ways and processes are often predictable, he says. And here's what the pattern is. That when things go wrong, here's what we end up doing. We tend to isolate and self-pity, and the thing that we begin to do is say, this is very personal. It's all about me. Instead of saying, that's bad, we start saying, I'm bad. Instead of saying, that's difficult, it says, there's no way for me forward. Now here's the truth. For sometimes, this isn't to say we shouldn't own our issues, right? It's not to say that we just we kind of cast blame on everybody else for all the things that where we failed to measure up or where we didn't do the thing we were supposed to do, right? So we still got to own our own responsibilities, yes, but we need to be very careful because sometimes it's not the issue that we messed up. It's just that the situation is a bad situation. Right? It's a difficult situation. And what happens is instead of saying, this whole thing is really tough or hard or bad, we just begin to tell ourselves we're bad. And not only do we make it very personal, then it becomes pervasive. Right? It's not just in the one thing, it's in everything. It's not the specific thing, it's all things. It's not just in this moment, right, that things at work are hard. So what we end up doing is it becomes pervasive. We come home, and not only is my relationship with my boss terrible, but now my relationship with my spouse is terrible, and my relationship with my kids is terrible, and my relationship with whoever else is terrible, and just I'm a terrible person, and everything is terrible. right? That's the predictable pattern. It's personal, it becomes pervasive, and then we begin to tell ourselves it's just simply permanent. It's always going to be this way. It's never going to get better. There's ever going to be any change of scenery. There's not going to be any way forward. There's just no opportunity that things could turn around. So we find ourselves convincing ourselves in these negative but predictable patterns that the one thing becomes personal, pervasive, and permanent. And Henry Cloud reminds us that it is a lie. It's a lie that we choose to believe. The pattern is predictable, but it's a lie, and we believe it, and so did Elijah. But here's what happens in verse 11. God said to Elijah in response, he says, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind came to tore the mountains and broke it in pieces, and the rock split before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the winds. And after the wind, an earthquake. And was the Lord in the earthquake? And after the earthquake came a fire. But was the Lord in the fire? Nope. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. In fact, some translators and commentators will say, not even a low whisper, but in the stillness or in the silence. This is where we get that phrase, the still small voice of the Lord. It wasn't in the great earthquake or the rushing wind or the grand fire or in any of those amazing things that often accompany a theophany of God. It was in the stillness and in the silence and in the quiet. God does not shout at Elijah in his desperation. And I love that. He just simply asks him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah says, exact same response verbatim, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They throw down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even only I, am left, and they seek to take my life away too." And the Lord said to him, "Go and return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. And yet I will leave 7,000 people in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." And so Elijah departed from there and found Elisha. And he goes on. And so the fascinating thing is, and I love this, that in the midst of Elijah's desperation, what he discovers is the presence of God in the stillness and in the silence, and God doesn't reprimand him. God certainly doesn't give Elijah his wish and just say, "Okay, Elijah, that's fine." He doesn't try to convince Elijah of anything. He is simply present with Elijah, and then after Elijah gives the exact same response, which indicates to us that Elijah still hasn't changed his mind about things. He's still mentally in that same space. What does the Lord do? He says, "Listen, I've got people who are faithful to me. There are prophets who are faithful to me. And Elijah, there is still work for you to do. And here's the task before you, that the work of the prophet is to anoint kings and to speak my message to the people. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and do this, and then this, and I want you to do this. And I just want to remind you, Elijah, that there are 7,000 people who have not bent their knee to Baal." And so here's what God has for Elijah. He just simply sends him back with work to do. And so what do we take from that? Well, just a couple of quick things I'll mention as we wrap up this morning. I love that one of the first things in Elijah's desperation, what's one of the first things he does as he's running away? He gets some sleep. He's just come through this incredible experience and moment, right? I'm sure it was tense. It was all day on the top of the mountain, right? At the word of God, the fire is going to fall, and there's people killed, and he's running for his life. Like, this has been a draining time in Elijah's ministry. It's been difficult, right? It's highs and lows and everything in between. And Elijah's just like, and he goes and he falls asleep. He's fearful and is exhausted, and he can't keep up the pace. And when you can't keep up the pace, what do you need to do? Rest. Sleep. You just stop the train and get off for a minute and put your head on the pillow. Now, I know sometimes that sounds easier than it's actually possible, because sometimes it takes a few attempts to get that rest and that sleep. Because what do? You toss and you turn, and if you're like me, your brain still doesn't stop. Right? It just keeps moving, and you gotta just find the way to slow that down. But Elijah takes some time to sleep, and then when he wakes up from the sleep, what's provided for him? Food. Fresh bread, something to drink, right? And then he falls asleep again. And then on the strength of that meal, what does he do? Goes for a 40-day run. I mean, whatever. Coral maybe, but the rest of us, I don't know how many of you are like, that might be your thing. Maybe Tasha, maybe you and the crowd could do a 40-day. No, so like Elijah goes for a 40-day run. Now I would just suggest to us that sleep helpful, yes. Food, good diet, something to drink, helpful. Yeah, don't do the McDonald's drive-through, okay? When you're in this moment, okay? Get something good to eat, right? Make Karen make you a loaf of bread. That might be helpful, okay? So listen, you need some sleep, you need some food, you need some exercise. I'd suggest maybe a few kilometers at first, not 40 days of running, but Elijah gets his exercise. So sleep's important, food's important, exercise is important. All those things physiologically, biologically helpful. Important to pay attention to, because again, I don't know if you're like me, when you get stressed and when you get tired and when things are consuming your mental capacity and you got so much to do and the load is heavy, it's a lot easier to run through McDonald's than to sit down and cook a good home meal, isn't it? I don't got time to go for a bike ride or a walk or a run on the treadmill or lift a few weights. Nobody's got time for that. I got this to do and this to do and this to do. Sleep, what's that? You're going to get up early, get the kids ready for school, you're going to stay up late. Here it is, 10:30, looking at my laptop, trying to figure out, man, I got to do this, and they're going to make this list, and that's got to get done, and all the things that got to take place, right? Like all those things, those are the default, I don't know, maybe I'm the only weird one, but those are the default tendencies we often have, and it leads us to isolation, it leads us to self-pity. We look at everything as personal, as pervasive, as permanent. We're never going to get through. We tell ourselves it's just a season, we'll get to the other side of it. It's just what it's like for now, whatever it might be. But Elijah needed the sleep, the food, the exercise. And then it's after he gets those things that God speaks to him, because he's ready to receive the word of God in that moment. And God gives him new meaning. He realigns Elijah's purpose and the call that God has on Elijah's life after those things happen. And the Lord says to Elijah, I still have a task for you. I still have a job for you. There are still things that you need to do that I've appointed you for. And so Elijah, in getting all those things figured out, gets sent back, and he pursues the will of God. And I think for us, as we think about our own lives and the places of discouragement or of defeat, of desperation, of just confusion, whatever it might be in, don't let these things slide. Listen, I'm telling myself this as much as I'm telling you, right? Don't let these things slide. Don't neglect these things. You need your sleep. You need a good diet. You need some good exercise. And these are things that we just all know are true and important, but we always keep trying to find another silver bullet apart from these that's going to be helpful, don't we? Because we want the quick thing that's going to be better. But these are things that are just time and time and time and time again are helpful and necessary. And in the midst of that, it's realigning our lives with the purpose and the plan of God for us in the midst of it, that we may be faithful to the Lord. Not that long ago, I was listening to a song, And in the midst of the song, I was reminded of this passage because the words come straight out of Isaiah chapter 40. And it was fascinating because when you begin to read Isaiah chapter 40, it starts in this way in verse 3. It says, "A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall become level and the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh will see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." And a voice says, "Cry." And I said, "What will I cry? All flesh is like grass, and its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers and the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." And then these verses that follow, starting at verse 25, I've known since I was a kid. But for whatever reason, more recently, they took on this new meaning for me. It says, and I think partly just because I completely misunderstood it from the beginning, "To whom will you compare me, says the Lord, that I shall be like him, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these? He who brings out their host by number and calls them by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one of them is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God?" Why do you complain and say things like that, he says. "Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Because even youth shall faint and be weary." People who are expected to be strong and not grow tired. "Even youths will faint and be weary, and young men will fall exhausted. But they that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not be faint." And just from my misreading of this whole text, you know what I always assumed from that passage? I always assumed that the reading was, those who wait on the Lord will always be strong. That's how I understood it. That's how I read it. But that's not what it says, right? It says we will grow weary. We will get tired. Even those of us who are expected to be able to go the distance and to push through and to just to have all the strength and vigor in the world, we will all grow weary and tired. But it's those who wait on the Lord will renew. They will renew their strength. Their strength will be renewed out of that place of weakness. They will not be weary, and they will walk and not be faint. And so we wait on the Lord with praise and prayer and persistence when we find ourselves in that space of the wild and the wilderness, looking for meaning and purpose and just ready to be done, whatever it might be, for whatever the reason or the circumstance. And God still says, I have a purpose for you. I have a plan for you. I have a role for you to play in terms of my kingdom and what I'm doing and for the sake of my fame and my glory. And I know you need your rest, and I know you need your sleep, and I know there's lots of things that need to be taken care of, but wait on me, and I will renew your strength.